what will President Trump do about the Middle East?
Well, the election has come at a time when Israel's campaigns against Hezbollah and Hamas have probably gone about as far as they can go in terms of military degradation of these two Iranian proxies. And obviously they've done a lot of damage to Gaza and Lebanon in the process. So far, in some ways, this has been contained. The Arab governments that signed under Trump, the Abraham Accords, haven't broken them. Hezbollah and Hamas have been dealt pretty big blows. They're still active. They're not completely eliminated. That was never likely that they would be. The Abraham Accords, which was the achievement of the Trump years in terms of getting a number of governments to have diplomatic relations with Israel, have held. There has been a lot of anger against Israel in the region and certainly outside, but Israel has not actually lost any diplomatic relations with anybody. And the Iranians are somewhat cowed because Israel has shown that they can hurt Iran more than Iran can hurt Israel. The problem with Israel is that it has got no plan as to how to actually end these wars. It's easier in some ways with Hezbollah and Lebanon because they basically need a ceasefire. They would like Hezbollah to be pushed back away from the border areas, possibly Lebanese forces, such as they are, coming back in. But basically, they need Hezbollah in a position where it's not going to try anything else again. Hamas is much more difficult, not because it's particularly strong, but because it's still there. And any of the potential schemes for the reconstruction of Gaza to deal with humanitarian crises there must involve other governments, and other governments won't do this unless Israel acknowledges Palestinian rights and in some ways seems to have a long-term plan for addressing them. So at the moment, Israel seems mainly interested in having some barrier in the north, but at some point, what's actually going on in Gaza itself must be addressed. Now, is Trump able to deal with that? I don't know. He can claim to have good relations with Netanyahu and good relations with the Saudis, who are going to be critical to any of that. So it's not inconceivable that he would be able to do something. We don't know particularly how Netanyahu is prepared to, what concessions Netanyahu is prepared to make, because to some extent he's listening more to voices within his own coalition, which help him stay in power, than he is to international voices. So I don't think there's any done deals in this yet, but at some point, just for humanitarian reasons, it must be addressed.
That's a good summary of where we stand, but the conversation at this point in history is still stuck in this idea of what kind of Band-Aid are we going to put on it this time. If we zoom out, as it were, to look at it as a regional problem, obviously, big players like Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries are not going to go along with any regional solution that does not involve a solution of some kind to the Palestinian statehood question. Some experts have put up ideas like, okay, we will get everybody involved. We'll get, if we can't get Iran involved, we'll at least get the Saudis involved, and we will pressure Israel into agreeing to a confederation, which is something that's not talked about too much in the past, where the Palestinians and the Israelis live by not only side by side, but form a sort of a loose coalition for, on the one hand, each would have their own foreign policy, but internally they would cooperate on the economy and so on and so forth with, international guarantees, perhaps, if not UN peacekeepers, then some Western-oriented peacekeepers. It's too early to really present that as a viable possibility, but it's out there. One of the problems is that Donald Trump is perceived, according to some reports, even by the Israeli leadership, as unstable in terms of his policy. I don't mean the campaign unstable that we hear about. I mean unstable and unreliable and unpredictable. What will it take to reach a regional stability? And you cannot have stability without Iran either being under control or neutralized or folded into the world economy and the regional economy. What could you see possibly viable?
I think that the difficulty with the Middle East is always it's actually not hard to think of solutions. The problem is getting there, because it never quite suits everybody at the same time to agree. So I don't think the starting point is a scheme that solves all these different issues. The starting point is where we are at the moment and what can be done, that moves things along. And in moving things along, I'd say there are two aspects of this. Initially, obviously, Israeli security and some sort of Palestinian security. Then you've got these bigger questions of the role of the Iranians, the role of the Saudis, and so on. So what's happened? The Iranians had a plan based on their axis of resistance to surround Israel by fire, and that's not looking so good anymore. It's not completely dead because the actors aren't dead completely, but they're certainly not in a good way. Only the Houthis really are coming out stronger at the moment from this than say Hezbollah and Hamas and Iran itself. Iran has got an ailing leadership with Khamenei. There's a reformist president who we know doesn't have that much power but has a bit. So you've got a process going there, and there's a lot of conversations going on, not all involving the West, about whether Iran will conclude that actually this preoccupation with Israel hasn't served it that well, and maybe there's better things that it could work on. Trump obviously last time round had a go at Iran. One of the most belligerent things he did was to kill the head of the IRGC, the Soleimani. So he's got a record on that, and so presumably he'll be quite happy to keep the pressure up. I don't think we're in any position to move to a Palestinian state in any shape or form at the moment, not because it's a bad idea. I think at some point it'll have to happen, but because they just don't have the capacity. The leadership in the West Bank is ineffectual and corrupt, not trusted by Palestinians. The leadership in Gaza is now virtually non-existent. It's present in local levels, but doesn't have authority, doesn't have resources. Just couldn't begin to start reconstructing the territory. So what you need is a process being set in motion that both deals with the immediate problems Palestinians face, and builds capacity. I think that's which comes from having responsibility and authority, but it's going to be limited to some time. We've also just got to keep an eye on the West Bank and Jerusalem, where a lot of this trouble was sort of started by right-wing settler groups in Israel, and who are still pretty active. So somebody's got to get a grip on this, and the obvious people are the Israeli government. I mean, they need to get a grip on it, but that's going to be hard while Netanyahu's in power, at least in power, supported by this coalition. So it's difficult because you've got to get lots of ducks in a row before the right things happen. And this question always comes down to what pressure can you put on Israel? Well, arguably, Trump can put more pressure on Israel than Harris would have been able to, because Trump is able, because there's nobody else for Netanyahu to go to. He's always backed on Republicans. He's got as sympathetic a Republican president as he's likely to get. So if this government still says do these things, then maybe he'll feel he has to. But again, I think he's still got an eye on the extremist elements within his own cabinet who help to keep him in power. Iran is very close to building a bomb, and one might assume that the events of this past year will encourage it to move forward. But Iran is weaker now, and will know that the pressure to come down on it, if it looks like it's making the final steps, will be quite hard. So I would have thought a wise policy would be a combination of carrots and sticks. Be quite tough on the things that you'd really don't want Iran to do, but at least begin to offer some way out of this, because Iran is a big and important country. It's got quite a lot to offer. There's no inherent reason why it should be the great enemy of Israel. Up to 1979, Israel's second biggest embassy was in Tehran. So I think what you need is some pretty active diplomacy, not making promises that you're not going to be able to sustain, and see if you can get a response from the Iranians. The difficulty is always the timing, because Iran is going to go through a transitional period with Khamenei ailing, maybe about to die. So the timing's going to be difficult. I think on the Netanyahu question, I think they'll be pretty strong. Netanyahu regularly promised things to Biden, then didn't see them through. This is all going to be remembered.
There are some opinion makers or policy experts who suggest that it's all very well to put this pressure on Iran by hitting Hezbollah and Hamas hard, but they haven't finished it off, that they should have a quiet talk with the Iranians in some way and say, in essence, look, we've infiltrated you. You're naked. You are hated by all these people that you said you were going to help. You've got the Lebanese dying for you, and you're not spilling one drop of blood. And they're begging us to be spies. So there's a joke going around that the supreme Iranian leader is missing. And the only ones who know where he is Israeli intelligence. Now, that may not be too far off the mark.
No.
So what would you think if the U.S. in some back channel said to Iranian responsible somewhere, look, we can destroy you. We don't necessarily want to destroy your nuclear program, because that's a problem for us if we do that. But if you don't stop this, killing Lebanese and harassing and killing Israelis on their northern border, we will go after you. We've just been teasing you. We can hit you anywhere you want. We can kill any of you anytime we want. That's not our objective. This is the U.S. government speaking theoretically. We want you to be part of the global community. So you've got two paths. You can continue on your path that you're on now, and we'll pretty much wrap you up. You probably will be driven from power, and whatever capacity you have, we'll eliminate it because we have the means to do it. Or you can work with us to establish a Palestinian state. If you work with us, we'll work with you. You can declare it a victory, that the great Satan is given into your policy, whatever you want. Do you get a sense that anybody's having that conversation?
Oh, I think people are aware of the possibilities. I think the starting point is that Iranian policy has failed. Here we have a situation in which Hamas set something in motion. How much the Iranians knew about it is still being debated. They knew something, but not the detail. Let's assume that. Hezbollah felt obliged to join in, but did so rather tepidly, but enough to give the Israelis a rationale for having a go at them. And Iran watched and eventually was provoked into action, which wasn't very successful twice, expending a lot of missiles, most of which didn't reach their targets, and those that did reach didn't do the damage that might have been expected. So I think the starting point is actually this isn't a very successful policy. Note the number of countries that not only maintain relations with Israel, but are not that displeased that Iran and its proxies have got bloody noses as a result of all of this. Of course, they're all irritated with Israel. They're all appalled by the way that Israel has conducted its campaign, but they don't think Iran's a victor in all of this. They think Iran has lost out. So I think that you've got to put the question back to Tehran. What do you want? Where are you trying to go? And it's a difficult conversation because there are undoubtedly some in Tehran who want to repair relations with the West, including, as far as one can tell, the new president. There are others who think this would be a rejection of everything the revolution has stood for. That conversation is going to go on. I don't think you necessarily resolve it by threatening action that will be difficult to take, because actually, if you look at Iranian debates to the extent that we can understand them, popular mood in Iran is to support the reformers. The popular mood is that they've had enough of a clerical regime, and the regime is aware of that. So I think the best strategy, and it'll take time, but these things can still happen quite quickly, is to encourage change in Iran, because that's what it requires. It's not just the Ayatollah suddenly deciding that all in all it's all been a terrible mistake, and actually he's quite happy to make up with the United States and with Britain and with Israel and so on. He won't. What you've got to do is to encourage a process of change and shift within Iranian policy, not because of great coups or insurrection. It's just a steady movement in that regard, and it could lead to insurrections. You can never quite tell if they've had them before. So that I think it's got to come from within Iran. There's limits to how far we can just coerce them from outside, but it's based on the starting point of a failed policy.
Absolutely. And the word encouraging is quite interesting because it's a carrot, it has to be a carrot and stick approach. The stick is quite evident. And as you point out, everybody concerned knows the potential. The carrot being dropping tariffs.
Well, they're under a lot of economic sanctions at some point.
Yeah, and bring Iran into the international fold, but there's no movement on that because I don't know what your perspective on it is. I really would like to hear it. Israel's not ready to make that happen. Israel wants to. They seem to have changed their policy from obsession with Iran as itself, with first now getting rid of Iran's proxies, both in Lebanon, Houthis and Hamas is self-evident. And until they're ready and feel secure, the political will in Israel is not going to exist. So what happens next?
Well, I think Israel was laboring under the misapprehension that Hamas was content running Gaza and had given up trying to badly hurt Israel. And that pretense was shattered on 7th of October 23. Hezbollah then came in. Israel, having believed that after 2006, they deterred Hezbollah. So Israel was all of a sudden faced with two conflicts on its northern and southern borders. And it's responded the way we've seen it respond, pretty toughly. They've now got to think about what security arrangements can take its place. And I think what many people find exasperating with Israeli policy is not that it's understandable that when these people are full of death to Israel and seem to want to act on that, that you take a pretty robust response. But you've still got to think what's a durable security arrangement. And it's hard to believe that just trying to keep the Palestinians in their place and suppressed is going to be such an arrangement. They still haven't got their hostages back. They still aren't in a position to send displaced people back to the northern border because Hezbollah can still send rockets in their direction. So Israel's got to think about security arrangements with Gaza and with Lebanon. With Lebanon, it's all there. It's not difficult to work out what needs to be done, the UN resolution and all that. With Gaza, it really needs imagination and a lot of new international effort. And Israel has to go along with that, because otherwise it's going to be left with a completely chaotic and anarchic Gaza in which Hamas will reconstitute, because nobody else really will be in a position to do so. Now, whether or not, how easy it is for them to accept this, many Israelis do. Many in the IDF fully understand this. It's not anathema to all Israelis, but it is to some, and they happen to be in government at the moment.
What can the new U.S. administration do to, using that word, convince or encourage, to get Israel to the point of engaging again with the Palestinian solution, to the point that the Saudis, who are gagging to get in there and get a regional conclave going, but they can't as long as if Israel doesn't make some meaningful steps toward a Palestinian solution. What can the next U.S. administration do to encourage that?
Well, I think this year has been, especially the last 6 months or so, has been dominated by what's going to happen on 5th of November. So that's over. You've now got a period before you start worrying about your next election, when you have a government that can say, look, we're the ones you're dealing with now, and this is what we'd like to see. So you don't have to look, the US government doesn't have to look over its shoulder all the time and just see how this is going on in the polls. It can start taking some stances. And Netanyahu.
Very good point. Very important point.
Netanyahu understands that. So I think you can have a much less tentative policy. I mean, we've had a period in which the Biden administration, has kept on demanding things of Netanyahu, apparently getting some hints that maybe this will happen this time, and it doesn't. And I just, they've had enough of it. And so I think you have a chance now, but you need a scheme. And I think my own preference would have been quite early on in this bout of fighting for the US with the Saudis and others in the region to call an international conference with the Europeans as well about Gaza. I think there's always this sort of mediating aspect that the thing to do is somehow to find a way of getting something to which all the parties can sign up to, and that's difficult. I think a new American administration ought to be in a position to take an initiative and say, enough of this, we must address this issue of Gaza. We will call an international conference of interested parties, obviously including Israel and the Palestinian Authority, and we'll hammer something out. Rather than wait for a deal to be done through Qatar or something, which can easily be disavowed and never quite take hold. And also because the humanitarian situation is urgent. It's not. I mean, it's a pretty desperate situation, and you can't start reconstruction without a government, without an authority in Gaza, which just doesn't exist at the moment.
Well, the new administration in the U.S. has to face this elephant in the room that doesn't seem to want to budge. That is, Israel appears not to feel that it's at the point that Iran will not be a threat, and that the implication of that, see if you agree or not, is that they need to do more to neutralize Iran militarily and convince the Iranians, whether they say it verbally or just get right to the verge of, when the Israelis can see the edge of the Iranians can see the edge of the cliff, and it appears not to be at that point yet. There needs to be, according to that thinking, there needs to be more military pressure brought to bear on Iran. Does that make any sense?
Yes, but I don't. I mean, I think, again, I'd have a slightly different conversation. First, you need to do something about Lebanon and Gaza. If you do something about Lebanon and Gaza, which in both cases would represent some sort of defeat for Hezbollah and Hamas, for the Iranian proxies, and for Iranian policy in general, then by itself, it requires a reappraisal. The strength of the Iranian position was always based on Hezbollah first, and then Hamas. The Houthis have come in a bit more and shown their effectiveness during the past year. So the Israelis could point to a defeat, what is in practice a defeat for Iran. Plus the fact that when Iran sent off its missiles, it didn't do that well. Now, it may, in the future, it may well be in a position to do more. And I think that issue is not easily going to go away because it's actually quite difficult to disarm Iran. I think it's possible to blunt Iranian aggression, but it's not that easy to disarm it, including in the nuclear sphere, or very much in the nuclear sphere. So I think it's a more nuanced policy that you need, and reflecting internal debates within Iran without being naive about any of this. This is what diplomacy is about. This is what good foreign policy is about. And you need to work with the Saudis and the Europeans and others in doing this. Just sort of blustery threats by themselves, I don't think is likely to achieve a positive outcome.
Another elephant in that same room is the Revolutionary Guard, which has a huge incentive not to have peace with Israel, or not to have sanctions dropped. It's making billions of dollars in smuggling outlawed goods. How do you control them?
Well, the Revolutionary Guard is obviously internally in Iran key to the whole thing. As you say, they do well out of the smuggling. Their raison d'etre is in all the various proxies, but they've been damaged by, in a sense, the failure of all of this. And the resentments within Iran are quite considerable. If you took a popular vote on whether or not the IGC should have a big role in Iranian government, I doubt if they'd get a lot of votes. But as a matter of practice, they're still very strong. It's part of the power struggle that will have to take place, and it's bound up with the whole question of clerical rule. And I think those who understand Iran far better than I do will point to tensions even within the religious community about whether the politicization of religion that has taken place has really been that healthy for both the religion and for Iran. So there will be some speculation when it comes to the replacement of Khamenei, which one has to assume will happen in the reasonably near future. How soon, who knows? That will be a point where some of those issues are going to be addressed. But there's no quick fix to any of this, especially by outsiders. And it's very difficult to engineer changes in somebody else's political system.
Getting Americans to concentrate on the Middle East as an issue is almost impossible in my experience as a reporter, unless there's devastation and a huge humanitarian crisis, which there was. And even at the height of the Hamas crisis, there was a lot of news coverage of it. But if you looked at the polls and looked at where the average American voter placed that as a issue of concern, it was pretty far down.
Yeah.
Is there a way of explaining to people who aren't policy elites like you, why should we care about all those people out in the desert killing each other? That is a common phrase used. And I faced this question for almost 50 years.
Yeah. Because it used to be the case that you cared because you got oil from the Middle East, but you don't anymore. China gets oil from the Middle East. India gets oil from the Middle East. It affects the oil price, generally what goes on there. But going back to 1973-4, when you had the oil embargo and the great hike in prices, you just don't have that reason to pay attention.
And there was the Cold War element.
And the Cold War element of a US-Russia competition, US-Soviet competition for influence in the region. And what's been quite interesting is Russia has not played its hand that well during this past crisis because it's got itself too much involved with Iran because of Ukraine, and I think has lost influence elsewhere, which leads on to other questions about Syria and what's going to happen with Syria. So look, it's a we all have this issue because it's a very difficult part of the world to explain. It's extremely complex. And while one might like to, see most conflicts in terms of goodies and baddies, it's not as simple. Even, if sympathies are with a democratic Israel, it doesn't always behave that well. So I think there's this, and the news is often just distressing. So I think anybody like me who spends all their time with war, finds that people have got a limited appetite to hear about terrible things going on when there's nicer things that they may want to spend their time with. So I think we're always going to have that sort of difficulty. In the end, this is an important part of the world, and the knock-on effects of state failure in the Middle East, for example, or if the Straits of Hormuz are blocked or whatever, would be felt in the United States elsewhere, as with Ukraine. It may seem very distant to Americans, understand it in terms of why did Russia do such a thing? How can we stop them? But the fact is, it led to an enormous boost in inflation in all our economies and set us all back. So the links are always there. But I think academics and journalists share a problem in this, in that things that preoccupy us are often not very nice, and unless you think you're going to, your kids are going to be drafted, or the bombs are going to start raining on you, you'll give it some attention, but it's still going to be limited.
Very limited, unless you can every once in a while tell people that your toaster is going to cost more because the supply chain is being blocked in the Persian Gulf.
Yeah. Those sort of things happen. So, I think we just have to accept that our audiences are interested but not large.
Well, this has been a feast of information on the Middle East, and I thank you for that. But I wondered if we could just kind of quickly run through the world.
Yeah.
I'll start with Europe and Russia and Ukraine because I know you're doing some updating on that. Why? What can we expect Donald Trump to do vis-a-vis Ukraine, given all of his rhetoric so far?
I mean, what Trump is going to do with Ukraine has been a matter of speculation for months. And you can find some people close to him who've indicated quite nuanced policy with pressure certainly on Zelensky to agree to some sort of peace deal or at least negotiations, but combined with pressure on Putin not to be over demanding in order to get at least a ceasefire and possibly a peace deal. There's an enormous gap between Ukrainian and Russian positions, which is, I mean, there's no mediation really to be done there. You're basically saying to the Ukrainians, look, this is the best you're going to get, and if you agree to this, we'll give you this and this support. And to the Russians, we're not going to abandon Ukraine if you keep on being absurd in your demands. I mean, there's that sort of conversation that may or may not happen. I think for Putin, there's an issue with Ukraine, and that his demands really are very great because it's quite hard for him to consider this a victory, even if he's got a lot of territory, so long as you have an independent Kyiv that is getting closer to the West. That's why he wanted to subjugate the country in the first place. That's why he wants neutrality, but not just neutrality. That he wants no security deals with other countries. He wants limits on Ukrainian armaments and so on. And I think that's going to be difficult for Trump to accept. But if Zelensky doesn't accept it, Trump is then left with a problem, which is how much does he abandon Ukraine as a democratic country against a Russia which has behaved cruelly and brutally and is totally unreasonable in its demands. And I think somehow Trump will need to indicate to Putin that one way or the other, he's not so keen on a new relationship with Russia that he can just completely give him everything he wants vis-a-vis Ukraine. And we'll see. And again, it takes time before, I mean, whatever Trump says about sorting this in a day, it takes more than a day to sort this because it's a complete mess. And the issue, one of the issues is what support is then given to Ukraine, even a rump Ukraine, if it's told to accept the loss of territory, which frankly, as far as Russia is concerned, is ruined land. Russia's ruined it. It's depopulated. It's full of unexploded ordnance, battered cities, and so on. It could be rebuilt, but not. I don't think by Russia. So even if Ukraine has had to concede a lot of this, they still want security for the rest, and that I think is going to be the main challenge. I can't see Ukraine agreeing to anything unless they feel the security of what they've got left is also guaranteed.
The key to anything there is whether the U.S. continues to support them and give them a resistance. And I think you put your thumb on a critical question, and with apologies to Donald Rumsfeld, that one of the big known unknowns is, will Trump carry out his rhetoric, or will he be pragmatic?
Yeah, I mean, I think Trump, you have to assume, normally believes his own rhetoric and will go in there believing he can do a deal. He always believes he can do a deal. But he's going to find the deal difficult in this case and high profile. This isn't something that going back to our earlier conversation, will just be something for the cognoscenti. I mean, this is very high profile. Plus the fact that Europeans are pretty committed to still to keeping Ukraine going one way or the other. And the Ukrainians are pretty committed to keeping going one way or the other. So it's not an easy thing. Now we can expect the Europeans to do more, and the Europeans expect to be asked to do more. I think that's understood to be part of the deal. But without America, that's pretty hard. And and another question is how much over the coming couple of months Biden can tie in more support that keeps Ukraine going at least for a bit longer.
Well,
But
as
you
you
just
very
have to
well
assume
know, European governments are quite worried about Trump's policies or his,
European governments have European
and
governments are very
the threat of NATO being kind of torn apart at the edges.
European governments are very worried about policies. Um, they've had to deal with Trump before. They've been thinking about it quite hard. Um, I think I think their main objective will be damage limitation with regard to NATO, keep the alliance going in some shape or form, and do it showing that they accept the need, which is Democrat policy as well, to take up more of the burden. And frankly, I think the main thing that's going to be worrying them is tariffs as much as NATO. I think an awful lot more contingency planning is going into how you stop descending into trade wars as fighting wars. Again, we've had this long period of what's going to happen after the election. The election's over. You've got a president. You've got a period in which everything isn't partisan politics. So maybe this is the time to set out again and freshly the case for supporting Ukraine. Be clear on what the limits of American support are, because there's bound to be some limits. But within those limits, what more can America can do, and what is expected of us, and what is expected of Ukraine in all of this? Because Ukraine has not done as much, for example, in mobilization as might have been the case. But that has to come with, really the all of NATO moving itself in ways that has not moved itself enough yet, in our own industrial capacity and so on. The basic message has to go to Moscow, I think, that we're not giving up on Ukraine. There's still limits on what you can achieve in the battlefield, and those gains don't get you very much unless they lead to a political victory, and you're a long way from that. So I think it needs a strong message with more resource and effort put behind it. And then I think there are going to be questions of negotiations and diplomacy and so on. But I don't think, I think quite strongly that NATO countries or the US doesn't have to always be looking to initiate this. I think you want Russia to think, actually, we need a way out, and them to start thinking about who do they talk to, China, Turkey, who knows? I think the issue with tariffs is what are you trying to do? Are you just trying to protect American industries from competition, or are you particularly bothered about unfair competition from China? If it's the first, look, the American economy, whatever may have been said during the election, looks pretty impressive from over here. It's getting growth rates that we dream about. It's got amazingly innovative companies who don't particularly need protection to help them. But China's an issue. But China's an issue for the Europeans as well. We get dumping too. I mean, the basic problem is China is overproducing, doesn't have the domestic market to take what it produces, and so dumps. And lots of countries are cross with that. So you either take a sort of unilateral approach to trade, or you take a multilateral approach to trade. There's a general view that China's trade practices don't conform with the rules, and it needs to be pushed back to Beijing to look how it manages its domestic economy better and generates demand from within China. So, and that, of course, is then becomes bound up with a wider question about U.S.-China relations and all those other issues. And that again is a matter for diplomacy and so on. But I think the American hand is stronger in that if it's evident that this is a joint approach and not just a unilateral approach. If you start having general tariffs just raised as a protectionist measure, then there will be responses, and it doesn't help anybody in the end. You do get into trade wars.
Power the U.S. has over the Chinese economy is immense. Does that act as a potential break against China making a military move against Taiwan?
I think, I mean, first, China's got quite a lot of American debt. So there's more interdependence between the US and China than there ever was between the US and the Soviet Union, for example. So they affect each other. I think a Chinese decision on Taiwan depends on a number of things. The most important, I believe, is the urgency of the issue. And it becomes urgent for Beijing if it looks like Taipei is irredeemably declaring itself independent of the mainland. I mean, it's a strange issue in many ways because it's obviously an independent entity in so many ways. But most countries, including the US, go along with the fiction that they're still basically part of the same country. If that is ended, then I think it would be almost impossible for the Chinese not to act in some way, given everything that they've said in the past. How they'll act is a different question, but I think they would act. Secondly, there's a question of what the military options are, which follows from that. One option is a blockade, which I think is how anything will start. The second option is direct military action, which is difficult. One thing the Chinese might have learned from Ukraine is these things never quite work out as you intend. And to my guess is they would anyway be starting with blockades and so on, which would be challenging. As soon as anything like that happens, the international economy goes into turmoil. Stock markets go down, people start panicking, buying gold, whatever they do in these circumstances. And Xi has to worry about that, not because this is, the Americans will block exports or anything, but just because he's got enough domestic problems without this adding to it. That's why my own view is that Xi is less interested in anything early on this than others would.
And if Taiwan did declare independence, it'd be shooting itself in the foot.
Yeah, and I think the Taiwanese know that. I mean, I don't have a lot of contact with Taiwanese, but the limited contact I've had doesn't suggest to me their ignorance of the issue in any shape or form. They just don't want to be under Beijing's thumb, but they're happy to do business with China. They quite like contacts between the mainland and the island, and they fully understand that if they say the wrong thing and make this policy, then all hell will break loose. So, I mean that's why I've been cautious on the issue and not assuming, as some do, that this is an inevitable crisis. I don't think these things are never inevitable anyway.
And Taiwan were to break the eight,
but
so to speak, it wouldn't necessarily follow that U.S. would feel compelled to intervene on its behalf because it broke the rules. It
yeah, I mean, I think it was a crisis that Taipei had obviously provoked. Um, then I think you'd get a more cautious response. But look, I mean, the promises have been made to Taiwan in the past, and um, American governments have always said they'd honour them. But that can mean a number of different things. At the moment, this is the main contingency for which the United States prepares, other than Russia. But for the US Navy, this is in particular more important. And obviously, something for which China puts in a lot of resources. So it becomes bound up with a longer term question because China is militarily getting stronger. Um, what are we just looking forward to an indefinite period of tension with China? Or are there possibilities for a different sort of relationship? And this is an issue that European governments, UK government, is addressing all the time. China is just not a country you can ignore economically. It's such a big player in the international economy. But on the other hand, countries like Germany that bet heavily on trade with China are getting burned. So again, the US isn't alone in these issues, and I think one of the challenges as somebody who watches the US very closely is getting Americans to realize that this isn't just about them. There are other countries facing similar issues, similar predicaments, who feel very close to the US, want to work closely with the US, and if involved, can help. And I think that, and China's, exactly one of those issues.
I did an interview a couple of years ago. I don't know if that's changed since, but the consensus was at that point that all of the war games played out in a theoretical matchup between China and the U.S. Out in the Far East. The U.S. doesn't win any of them.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. Again, it depends what you're trying to do. And also, military technology is moving along very fast at the moment, especially with regard to drones and so on. And obviously, when you're talking about the situation in the Far East, it's different from one in Europe. But I think there's a lot coming out of Ukraine. It's described as a test bed for modern warfare. A lot coming out, which is going to change calculations. I mean, just look at what the Ukrainians have done to the Russian Black Sea Fleet when they don't even have much of a navy, hardly any navy themselves, and you start to see possibilities that would give actually both the US and China thought in the future. It's different because there'll be more air power involved and so on. But one of the things I've learned from essentially a lifetime studying wars is only on occasion do they turn out as expected.
What do you expect President Trump to do in the next 4 years on China?
I think a lot depends. Well, the thing about Trump, which he doesn't hide, is he quite likes talking with strongmen. He admires strongmen, and he put Z in that category. So again, you've got this, and I don't think Trump is particularly ideological in the way a Cold War president might have been. I think he's interested in power and deals. It's a very transactional sort of approach with some basic fixations, of which tariffs is certainly one. And you may recall early on in the previous presidency, Trump had Z to Mar-a-Lago, and made a fuss of him there. So I would have thought you've got this tension between believing that this is a man to man, I can do a deal with, and the fact that he's pledged himself to these tariffs. And I can't see how he can get out of some of the tariffs. I think that'll happen. And then the question becomes what sort of economic advice he's being given and taken, because he has some people around him who are clearly as enthusiastic about tariffs as he is. But there are many businesses who are petrified by the cost to the American economy, because tariffs are paid in America, and the possibilities of trade wars. So something will happen, but how high tariffs go is one thing people will be watching. How directed they are is another thing people will be watching. And it's going to be quite difficult to start doing deals and having friendly conversations with China when the Chinese believe that he's trying to ruin their economy. So there's a tension there. And you come also to the point that some of these issues are easier to deal with if it's a multilateral effort, because lots of countries are cross about the way that China dumps goods on them. But they're not going to be that sympathetic if the tariffs are being applied to them as well. So these are the big strategic decisions that to be made.